Very often you hear arguments, or at least you hear the caricature of the argument for the vision of marriage as a man and a woman, as one simply from history. It's always been that way, so it always should be that way. And that's not the kind of argument we're making today. We're not making one from moral condemnation of same-sex relationships either. We think there is a prior question to that of what marriage is that would be the same kind of argument and would have the same kind of answer whether the challenge to marriage law today were about same-sex relationships or about some other deviation from the understanding of marriage that we're going to defend. And it's also not a religious argument. And the reason for that is not some secret strategy. It's not simply a practical idea that if we used religious arguments, they wouldn't be effective, though certainly in some contexts they're not as effective as other forms of argument. But because we think there is a pre-theological truth here, or to put it in a different way, that the theological truths about marriage that are common not just to the Christian tradition, but the Jewish and Muslim traditions, and to various, in some Eastern understandings, and even to some non-religious, non-theistic philosophies, reflect something about the human good. In other words, that the reason that God teaches what God has taught, if these traditions are right, is that it reflects the truth about human nature and what makes people live and be well. And that there is even a theological reason to get into those non-theological reasons about marriage. It shows you the wisdom of this law, and that it's not just a capricious or despotic sort of decree, and it gives you a deeper appreciation for living by them. So that's just a general framing of what kind of argument we're going to make. Usually this debate seems like it's settled by a very different framing, which is the framing of it as a matter of equality, simply speaking. Marriage is a good thing. The proposal today is to expand the pool of people eligible to marry. And if you're just faced with a good thing that more people want, equality says you give it to them. In fact, you give it to them on an equal basis. And that framing of the issue seems to settle the debate in the other direction. I think it makes it hard for people with good instincts on the issue to articulate a reasoned defense of understanding marriage and enshrining marriage in the law as the union of a man and a woman. And one of the main things we want to get across today is that that is the wrong framing. That is a deep misunderstanding of what the debate is about. It's not about equality. Everybody in the debate believes in human equality, and everybody in the debate believes that marriage, whatever it is, should be recognized on an equal basis. What we disagree about is what marriage is. What we disagree about is when it's a marital relationship that might be going unrecognized under some particular scheme, and when what's not being recognized is something else entirely, which is not just fair not to include as a marriage, but which it's harmful to include as a marriage if there's some social and public value to figuring out what marriage is and to teaching that by the law at all. So what the debate is really about is a competition between two views of that issue, of two visions of what marriage is. And the vision that's on offer in the proposal to redefine marriage today is a vision of marriage mainly as a form of emotional union or companionship. What makes a marriage different from other forms of friendship, on this view, is its degree of emotional union or intensity or priority. After all, that is what would separate two men who live together and are in love and want to commit to each other and can get a marriage license in New York from two brothers who are committed to sharing the burdens and benefits of common life and to living together indefinitely, but don't have that romantic element and can't, therefore, get a marriage license in New York, to take just one example. What makes them different is a certain kind of emotional companionship, or romantic or domestic partnership. That's the vision of marriage on offer. And one thing we argue in the book, and that I think we can argue today, again on terms accessible to everybody, is that that vision of marriage must get marriage wrong. And the way you can see that is that it can't explain other features of marriage that people on both sides of the debate still acknowledge. Take a simple example. The idea that to get off the ground at all, marriage has to be pledged to permanence. That idea makes no sense as anything other than an arbitrary restriction, an old hang-up, just a tradition. If what makes a marriage is the emotional union. As long as the emotional union is there, you have a marriage, but as soon as that's gone and it's not something we have direct control over, then so is the marriage. It's reverted to a friendship. We shouldn't pledge permanence as opposed to say to be together as long as that emotional union lasts, or as long as love lasts, as some people have changed their vows to be. The idea of permanence makes no sense. Sexual exclusivity. If what really makes a marriage is an emotional union or intensity or priority, then maybe for some people, based on temperament or taste, exclusivity will serve that and foster it, and for some it won't. Or for some, according to their own understanding, it would do the opposite. And sexual openness in the relationship, an agreement not to be sexually exclusive, would actually foster the emotional union that's what really makes the marriage on this view. So that too becomes arbitrary, permanence and exclusivity. But even monogamy, the idea that marriage is inherently a relationship of two people, that group unions can't make a marriage, makes no sense. If what makes a marriage is a certain shared emotional union, plus domestic life, well, 3 men can have that just as well as 2 men, or a man and a woman. They can have emotional union, they can find most personal fulfillment in the group bond, they can want that to have the same equal social status and dignity, they can want their children reared in this kind of relationship not to be stigmatized, they can want the same tax breaks that are given to monogamy. So permanence, exclusivity, monogamy, even the idea that marriage is a sexual relationship at all, ultimately makes no sense on this view. Because this view says that what makes marriage different is the degree of intensity of emotional union. It would be pretty arbitrary to say that the only way you could have that is in a sexual relationship, that the platonic bond of 2 sisters who love each other deeply, who commit to a common life, who have the common stock of memories and sympathies that comes from sharing a home, would have something radically different if all that sex is contributing in the other relationship is just emotional union. That's all that the value of sex has on this vision, this alternative vision of marriage. In other words, everything that makes marriage different from deep friendship, from companionship in general, the idea that it's between 2, that it has to be pledged to permanence or exclusivity, even that it's a sexual union, makes no sense on this new vision of marriage. And so the vision of marriage must be incorrect, and incorrect by both sides' lights. This is not just something that conservatives are saying. This is not just something that proponents of the conjugal, what we have called the conjugal understanding of marriage, say. Increasingly, it's something that's being admitted by the leading proponents of redefining marriage. To give just one example, there's a statement called Beyond Marriage that's signed by over 300 LGBT and allied scholars and activists. Mainstream people like Judith Stacy, whom Ryan's going to debate in a couple days at NYU, like Cornel West, a colleague and friend of Professor George's, who say, yeah, absolutely, sexual complementarity is arbitrary, it's a hang-up, it's just a tradition, but so is permanence and exclusivity and monogamy and the presumption of sex. And so we should recognize as marriage, or the legal equivalent, not just same-sex relationships, but deliberately temporary relationships, multiple partner relationships, multiple household relationships, and even non-sexual ones. In other words, they and we agree that on this new vision of marriage, sexual complementarity and everything else that makes marriage different will rise or fall together. And we just disagree on whether they should rise or fall. The next thing you might ask is, okay, if that's wrong, if it can't just be emotional union, if that collapses marriage into companionship, what's the alternative? Maybe these are just arbitrary restrictions, or they're not arbitrary, but the only way we have of knowing them is, the only way we can give them a coherent unity is from revelation. And that if it weren't for that revelation, they wouldn't have a unity. But we think that's incorrect. We think revelation is tracking a human good here. And the way that we capture that human good is by the unifying idea of comprehensive union. In other words, we ask what it is that makes any form of union or community at all. And we think it's always common action. It's activity towards common ends in the context of a commitment. And in each of those three ways, the unifying activity, the unifying common ends, and the unifying commitment, the community that makes a marriage is comprehensive. And that this is an idea that's reflected not just in the religious tradition. So let's take the first thing, the unifying activity. In other forms of friendship, in other forms of companionship, people are united in heart and mind. They come to know and seek the other person's good. Only in marriage is union comprehensive. Does it include the whole of the other person, of the beloved? That's what romantic desire seeks, and it finds its fulfillment in the comprehensive union of marriage. But what is comprehensive union in that sense? Well, your person includes your body. The body is a real part of the person. And for that reason, any union that didn't include bodily union wouldn't be comprehensive. And what's bodily union? You can look at the Genesis idea of one flesh union as a very deep, profound abbreviation of this concept. What makes the parts of a single person one flesh? My heart, my lungs, and so on. It's that they're actively coordinated together towards a single end that encompasses them all, which is my biological life. And the remarkable thing about being a human being, in fact, the remarkable thing about being a mammal, is that that deep kind of bodily union, active coordination towards a single end that encompasses them all, is possible between two people, but just in one respect, with respect to reproduction. And it's in what the law as well as the church has called the marital act, the act that seals or completes a marriage, that a man and a woman become, in their bodies, actively coordinated towards a single end, the reproduction of them as a couple. So they become, in that respect, truly and not just metaphorically, one flesh. Comprehensive union in the activity. Comprehensive union with respect to the goods that it's ordered around. So you have different communities ordered around different goods. The community that you constitute here is ordered around the good of knowledge. And so it's going to abide by the norms that are required for that, open disclosure, academic integrity, and so on. But the relationship of marriage is not just ordered to this or that good, but to the whole range of goods that comes about in domestic life. Why is that? Well, the very act that makes marital love, on this view, is also the act that makes new life, new human beings, new participants in every aspect of the good. New people who have to be developed not just with respect to their intellectual abilities, but in terms of recreation and physical health and so on. And so marriage itself, the relationship that's embodied by that act ordered to new life, is as a community, ordered to, or deepened, or enriched by the bearing and rearing of whole new human beings, and therefore to the whole wide sharing of domestic life that's required for bringing those new human beings to maturity. So it's comprehensive in the dimensions of the partners united, including the body. Through that bodily union, it's oriented to or enriched by procreation and therefore all the range of goods. And it's also comprehensive in the commitment that it requires because of those two senses of completeness. If it's really making them one flesh in the marital act and one flesh in the new life that they can bring about together, then it also calls for a comprehensiveness of commitment. And through time, that means permanence, and at each time, that means exclusivity. So here's a view of marriage that makes sense of the idea that it's two, that it's permanent, that it's exclusive, that it's a sexual union, that it has some connection to family life and to the wide sharing of goods, and therefore, as Ryan will tell us, to the common good. It's something that the whole community will take an interest in. And it can explain them without appealing to any specific revelation, but with magnificent reflection and summary in key concepts of revelation like one flesh union. Concepts that Aristotle and Socrates and Xenophanes and Musonius Rufus and Plutarch saw just as well as Moses or St. Paul. And it's that vision of marriage which we find across time and place for millennia, basically in every society that we know of before the year 2000, that's being challenged today. Not challenged with an expansion, not challenged with the true principle of equality, but challenged with a contender, a different and much watered down vision of marriage that collapses marriage and companionship, that abolishes marriage as its own category at all.